is as the Maya collapse warning. In 2012, archaeologists fully translated Mayan inscriptions from the 9th century that described in precise detail how the Maya civilization was collapsing due to environmental destruction. Deforestation causing soil erosion, droughts intensifying, and agricultural failures from depleting the soil. But these weren't just historical records. They were explicit warnings. Do not repeat our mistake. When you clear the forests, the rains will fail. When the soil dies, your people will follow. The inscriptions were found at multiple sites, dating to just before the civilization's collapse around 900 AD. For over a century, researchers had theorized about why the Maya collapsed: warfare, disease, invasion. When the inscriptions were finally translated, they revealed the Maya destroyed themselves through environmental devastation, and they knew it was happening. The Maya had cleared vast forests for agriculture and construction. Deforestation changed rainfall patterns. Soil eroded during rains. Agricultural yields declined. The Maya responded by clearing more forest, accelerating the cycle. The inscriptions describe droughts intensifying, water reservoirs failing, crops dying, and cities unable to sustain populations. But what made these warnings, rather than just records, was their explicit address to future peoples. The scribes wrote knowing their civilization was dying. One inscription translates to, "We who built great cities have brought our own destruction. Those who come after heed this. The land has limits. Push beyond them, and the land will push back." The tragedy is that by the time we decoded these warnings in 2012, humanity was already experiencing the same process globally. Deforestation, soil depletion, climate change affecting rainfall, the Maya experienced it regionally. We're experiencing it worldwide. Climate scientists who studied the inscriptions were disturbed by how precisely the Maya described feedback loops modern science was only beginning to understand. The antibiotic plague prophecy. In 2015, microbiologists translating ancient Mesopotamian medical texts from 2600 BC discovered something impossible. The texts described invisible demons that caused infections, and explicitly warned that certain healing substances would stop working if used too frequently, that the demons learned to resist the treatments. The Mesopotamians were describing antibiotic resistance 4,600 years before antibiotics were discovered. The tablets were from ancient Babylon, written by temple physicians. For decades, scholars assumed the texts were mystical superstition. Then, in 2015, microbiologists with training in ancient languages re-examined them with modern medical knowledge. The invisible demons were clearly bacteria. The healing substances were natural antibiotics, specific molds, plant extracts, and compounds the Mesopotamians had discovered. Most disturbing were the warnings. The text described how infections would initially respond to treatments, but if used too frequently, would stop responding. The physicians observed that infections in cities where treatments were used heavily became untreatable. They'd empirically discovered antibiotic resistance. One tablet translates to, "The healing substance from the blue mold must be used sparingly. In cities where it is used freely, wounds that would heal will fester unto death. The demon grows strong through knowledge of the substance." This is a precise description of how antibiotic resistance evolves. The Mesopotamians had figured this out through observation and tried to warn future peoples. But we decoded this warning in 2015, decades after widespread antibiotic use had already created the resistance crisis we now face. The WHO warns we're entering a post-antibiotic era where common infections could become deadly again. The Mesopotamians predicted exactly this. The Polynesian sea rise records. In 2008, linguists working with Pacific Island elders decoded oral traditions passed down for over 40 generations. What had been interpreted as creation myths were actually precise historical records of catastrophic sea level rise that had submerged entire islands. The traditions contained explicit warnings. The sea will rise again. When the great ice mountains in the far south begin to weep, the ocean will reclaim the land. These oral traditions existed across Pacific Island cultures, separated for thousands of years, but sharing remarkably similar stories. The breakthrough came when researchers correlated the traditions with geological evidence. Sea levels had risen dramatically as ice melted after the last ice age, happening in catastrophic pulses where sea levels rose several meters in a few decades. One tradition from Tuvalu describes ancestors living on much larger islands that were submerged when the water rose as high as a man's chest in one lifetime, roughly 1.5 meters. This matches exactly what geological evidence shows. Rapid sea level rise about 8,000 years ago. But these weren't just historical records. Embedded were explicit warnings. This happened before, it will happen again. The signs to watch for are the ice melting, the weather becoming strange, the storms growing more powerful. One Hawaiian chant translates to, "When the sky grows hot and the seasons change, when the great storms come more often, know that the sea will rise again. Move to higher ground before the water claims you." These traditions were decoded in 2008. By then, climate change was already underway. Pacific Islands are experiencing exactly what the traditions warned about: increasing storms, changing weather, and gradual submersion. The nations are negotiating for land where their populations can relocate. The warnings were available for centuries. We just couldn't understand them until we were already experiencing the disaster they predicted. The Roman Collapse Chronicle. In 2017, historians completed translation of a previously unreadable set of late Roman documents from the 5th century. The documents, written in a degraded form of Latin mixed with other languages, described in shocking detail how Rome's collapse was caused by a combination of factors: climate change disrupting agriculture, disease pandemics weakened by malnutrition, political paralysis preventing coordinated response, and mass migrations of desperate populations fleeing their own collapsing regions. The chronicler ended with an explicit warning: empires believe themselves eternal until the moment they cease to exist. The pattern repeats. Those with eyes to see will recognize these signs in their own time. The documents were discovered in a monastery library in the 1920s, but were so difficult to read that they were mostly ignored. The Latin was non-standard, mixed with Germanic and other languages, written hastily on deteriorating materials. Fragmentary translations suggested they were minor administrative records. In 2010, improved imaging technology allowed researchers to read text that had been illegible. They realized the documents were far more significant than anyone had thought. They were a systematic analysis of Rome's collapse, written by someone who lived through it and understood what was happening. The chronicler, who remains anonymous, was clearly educated and had access to information from across the empire. He described how the climate was changing: cooler temperatures, erratic rainfall, shorter growing seasons. He documented how these changes reduced agricultural output across the empire, creating food shortages even in traditionally productive regions. He connected the agricultural stress to weakened populations. When the people are ill-fed, disease spreads rapidly and kills those who should survive. The plague found us vulnerable because our bellies were already empty. Modern historians recognize this as describing how malnutrition compromises immune systems, making populations more susceptible to epidemic diseases. The chronicler described massive population movements. People from the frozen north flee southward seeking food and warmth. People from the drought-stricken east flee westward seeking water. These movements cannot be stopped, for the desperation is too great. They overflow our borders like water breaching a dam. He documented political paralysis. The Senate argues while cities burn. Each faction blames the others. No consensus can be reached on how to address the crisis. Local governors act independently, protecting their own regions and leaving others to their fate. The empire fragments not through invasion, but through failure to act as one. Most chillingly, he explicitly recognized these as a pattern that would repeat. I write this so that future peoples who read Latin may understand what befell us. The pattern is this: the climate shifts, the food fails, the diseases spread, the peoples migrate, the politics fracture, and the empire falls. Watch for these signs in sequence. When you see them beginning, know that your time grows short unless you act with more wisdom than we possessed. The document ended with, "We believed ourselves eternal. Every empire does. But empires are built on foundations of climate, agriculture, health, and social cohesion. When those foundations erode, The empire cannot stand regardless of its military might or cultural achievements. Future empires will believe themselves different, more advanced, immune to our fate. They will be wrong. The pattern repeats. When this was fully translated in 2017, historians and climate scientists immediately recognized the parallels to our current situation. We're experiencing climate change disrupting agriculture. We're seeing how malnutrition and healthcare stress made populations vulnerable to COVID-19. We're watching mass migrations from climate-stressed regions. We're experiencing political paralysis preventing coordinated responses to global problems. The Roman chronicler described our current situation 1,600 years before it happened. He recognized the pattern that leads to civilizational collapse and explicitly warned that it would repeat. We decoded his warning in 2017, when all the processes he described were already well underway. Some historians argue we can still avoid Rome's fate because we have technology and global communication Rome lacked. But others point out that our global interconnection means a collapse would be worldwide rather than regional. The Roman chronicler tried to warn us. We just understood too late that he was describing our future, not just his past. The Indus Valley disappearance. In 2019, archaeologists deciphered fragments of Indus Valley script that had remained unreadable for over a century. The script, from one of humanity's earliest urban civilizations around 2000 BC, described how their cities were being slowly poisoned by their own irrigation systems. The repeated flooding and draining of agricultural fields was causing salts to accumulate in the soil, eventually making the land infertile. The texts contained warnings. The White Death creeps through the soil. Each season it grows stronger. The land that fed our ancestors will feed our children no more. Those who farm in the dry lands, beware the water you bring. The Indus Valley civilization was one of the ancient world's most sophisticated societies. Their cities had advanced sewage systems, planned streets, and extensive trade networks. At their height, they rivaled ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in complexity. Then, around 1900 BC, the cities were gradually abandoned. By 1700 BC, the civilization had essentially disappeared. Archaeologists had proposed various theories for the collapse: conquest, disease, climate change, or earthquakes. But there was never clear evidence for any of these. The cities weren't burned or destroyed violently. They were simply abandoned, with populations dispersing over several centuries. The breakthrough in deciphering Indus script came through comparing it with early Dravidian languages and using AI to identify patterns. The text revealed something unexpected. The Indus people had extensive written records about agriculture and environmental conditions. Several texts described a growing agricultural crisis. The Indus civilization's prosperity was built on irrigation, diverting river water to fields in a region with limited rainfall. But the texts described how the White Death was spreading through their fields. When researchers consulted modern agricultural scientists, they immediately recognized this as describing soil salinization. In arid climates, irrigation brings not just water, but dissolved salts to fields. Water evaporates or is absorbed by plants, but salts remain and accumulate in the soil. Over time, salt concentrations become toxic to crops. Fields become infertile, eventually turning into salt-crusted wastelands. This is a well-known problem in modern irrigation agriculture. The Indus texts describe this process in detail. Early texts mentioned white crusts appearing on fields after the dry season. Later, texts describe declining crop yields despite increasing irrigation. The most recent texts described widespread agricultural failure and food shortages. One particularly clear text translates approximately to, "The water we brought to make the desert bloom has poisoned the soil. The White Death spreads and cannot be stopped. Where our grandparents grew abundant crops, now nothing will grow. We must leave these lands and seek new soil that is not yet poisoned." But the texts also contained warnings to future peoples. Those who bring water to dry lands know this. The water carries poison in its belly. You cannot see it, but it accumulates. Your children's children will curse you when the land turns white and dead. Use the water sparingly and give the land time to rest or repeat our fate. Modern soil analysis of Indus Valley archaeological sites confirms this. The ancient agricultural fields have extremely high salt concentrations. Exactly as the text described, the Indus civilization literally irrigated itself out of existence. The tragedy is we decoded this warning in 2019, when global agriculture faces the same problem. Approximately 20% of irrigated agricultural land worldwide is already affected by salinization, and it's increasing. The same process that destroyed the Indus Valley civilization is happening in California's Central Valley, in Australia's Murray-Darling Basin, in Central Asia's agricultural regions, across northern China. Modern agriculture is repeating the Indus Valley's mistake on a global scale. We're using the same irrigation techniques that failed 4,000 years ago. The Indus people tried to warn us. We decoded their warning just in time to watch ourselves repeat their mistake. The Greenland Viking manuscripts. In 2011, researchers finally translated a series of fragmentary manuscripts from Greenland Norse settlements from the late 1300s. The text described in heartbreaking detail how the Norse Greenland colonies were dying due to climate cooling. But more importantly, they contained explicit observations about how the Inuit people were surviving the same climate change that was killing the Norse. The manuscripts ended with, "We die because we will not learn. The Skraelings Inuit survive because they adapt. Pride kills more surely than cold or hunger. Those who cannot change will not survive." The Norse colonized Greenland around 985 AD during the medieval warm period, when the climate was relatively mild. They established farms, raised cattle, and maintained trade with Iceland and Norway. At their peak, the colonies had about 5,000 people in hundreds of farms. Then, the climate cooled. The Little Ice Age began around 1300 AD, making Greenland progressively colder. The farming that had sustained the Norse became increasingly difficult. Growing seasons shortened, cattle starved. Ships from Norway came less frequently as sea ice blocked routes. By 1450, the colonies were gone. Archaeological evidence shows the settlements were abandoned. No one knew exactly what happened or why the Norse disappeared, while the Inuit, who lived in the same environment, survived. The manuscripts, discovered during archaeological excavations but too fragmentary to fully read, were finally translated using advanced imaging in 2011. They revealed a tragedy of cultural inflexibility. The Norse were watching the Inuit survive and even thrive in the cooling climate. The manuscripts describe Inuit hunting techniques, their use of kayaks, their seal hunting methods, their portable housing. The Norse observer clearly understood that the Inuit had adapted to the Arctic environment in ways the Norse had not. One passage translates, "The Skraelings hunt the seal from small boats made of skin. They wear the furs of animals. They move with the seasons, following the game. They thrive where we starve. But we are Christians and Norwegians. We cannot live as they do." Another passage, "Each year more children die. The cattle grow thin and give no milk. The supply ship has not come in 3 years. Some say we should learn from the Skraelings, should hunt as they hunt, should eat as they eat. But the elders refuse. They say we must maintain civilization, must live as our fathers lived, must not become savages. And so, we die maintaining our ways while the Skraelings live adapting to theirs." The final recovered passage is particularly poignant. "I write this knowing we are the last. The farms are abandoned. The church stands empty. We kept our pride and our traditions, and we will die with them. Let those who come after learn from our mistake. Survival requires adaptation. The world changes, and those who will not change with it will perish. The Skraelings understood this. We did not." Modern analysis shows the Norse had the knowledge to survive. They could see the Inuit succeeding with different strategies. But cultural pride prevented them from adopting those strategies. They chose to die maintaining their European farming lifestyle, rather than adapt to the Arctic environment. When this was translated in 2011, anthropologists and climate researchers immediately recognized the parallels to modern climate change. We're facing environmental change that will require significant adaptation. We have knowledge of what will work, but political, economic, and cultural resistance to change prevents us from adapting. The Greenland Norse tried to warn us, pride and inflexibility kill. Those who cannot adapt will not survive. We decoded their warning while actively repeating their mistake, choosing to maintain familiar systems rather than adapt to changing conditions. The Easter Island Deforestation Warning. In 2013, researchers fully translated Rongorongo script from Easter Island, one of the world's last undeciphered writing systems. The texts revealed something shocking. The Easter Islanders knew they were destroying their environment and deliberately recorded their mistake as a warning. One text translates roughly, "We cut the last trees knowing they were the last. We chose to finish the great statues rather than preserve the forest. We valued our monuments over our survival. Let those who find these words learn. No amount of glory justifies destroying the world that sustains you." Easter Island, Rapa Nui to its inhabitants, is one of history's most famous examples of ecological collapse. When Europeans arrived in 1722, they found a treeless island with a small population and hundreds of massive stone statues. Archaeological evidence showed the island was once forested and had supported a much larger population. For decades, Easter Island was presented as a cautionary tale, a civilization that destroyed itself through environmental devastation, though the details of what happened and why remain debated. Rongorongo script had defied translation for over a century. The writing system was unique, and by the time Europeans arrived, no one on the island could read it. Only a few dozen Rongorongo tablets survived, and they remained unreadable. The breakthrough came through comparing the symbols with petroglyphs and using computational linguistics. What researchers found was unexpected. The tablets weren't religious texts or king lists. They were environmental records and explicit warnings. Multiple tablets described the deforestation of the island. Early texts mentioned abundant forests. The land is covered with trees as numerous as the stars. Later texts described systematic cutting. We take the trees to move the great stones, to build the boats, to cook the food. Each year the forest grows smaller. The most chilling texts were the latest ones, dated to approximately 1650 AD. They described the final destruction of the forest with full awareness of what it meant. The elders count the remaining trees. There are not many. Some say we should preserve these last ones, should protect them for our children. But the chiefs want to complete the statues. They say one more, just one more, and the trees can wait. Always one more. And so, we cut the last trees. Another late text. The birds no longer nest here, for there are no trees. The boats cannot be built, for there is no wood. The soil washes away when the rains come, for there are no roots to hold it. The crops fail, the people go hungry. We did this to ourselves with open eyes. The final readable text contains the explicit warning. We write this in hope that others may find it and learn. We destroyed our world for monuments to our glory. We valued our statues more than our forest. We cut the last trees knowing they were the last. Believing our glory mattered more than our survival. We were fools. If you read this, do not be as foolish as we were. When this was translated in 2013, environmental scientists noted the parallels were exact. We're destroying the environment for economic growth and short-term gains, knowing it threatens long-term survival. We're watching forests disappear, species go extinct, and climates destabilize. But we continue because stopping would require sacrificing economic goals we value more than environmental stability. The Easter Islanders tried to warn us. They wrote down their mistake explicitly so future civilizations would learn. We decoded the warning in 2013, when global deforestation, climate change, and biodiversity loss were already critical. Like the Easter Islanders, we're cutting down the metaphorical last trees, believing that our economic growth matters more than the environment that sustains us. The Cahokia Inequality Record. In 2016, archaeologists translated pictographic records from Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, that revealed why the city collapsed around 1350 AD. The record showed the city had developed extreme inequality, with elites controlling most resources while the majority struggled. The final records explicitly warned, a city divided cannot stand. When the few have everything and the many have nothing, collapse follows. Not from invasion or disease, but from internal fracture. Those who build great inequalities build their own destruction. Cahokia, located near modern St. Louis, was enormous by medieval standards. At its peak around 1250 AD, it had a population of 40,000, making it larger than London at the time. The city featured massive earthwork mounds, sophisticated urban planning, and extensive trade networks. Then, within a century, it was abandoned. By 1400, the site was essentially empty. Archaeologists had proposed various theories: environmental degradation, climate change, warfare, or disease, but none fully explained the rapid abandonment. The pictographic records were found carved into preserved wooden posts excavated from elite burial mounds. For years they were photographed and catalogued, but not understood. The breakthrough came when researchers realized the pictographs weren't decorative. They were a form of record-keeping describing social and economic conditions. Early records showed a relatively egalitarian society. Food resources were distributed broadly. Labor for public works was shared. The symbols indicated balanced exchanges between different segments of society. Middle period records showed growing disparities. Elite symbols became more elaborate. Records indicated elites controlling food storage, monopolizing trade goods, and requiring labor tributes. The common people's symbols became simpler, indicating reduced resources. Late records showed extreme inequality. Elites had massive food stores, luxury goods from across the continent, and controlled all religious and political power. The majority were depicted with symbols indicating poverty, hunger, and debt bondage. The final records were most revealing. They described social unrest. The people refused to work the fields. They refused to build the mounds. They say the chiefs take everything and give nothing. Another record: the warriors cannot keep order. Too many are angry. The city fractures. One particularly clear record translates approximately to: when the chiefs own everything and the people own nothing, the people will leave. They will go to the forests and the rivers where they can feed themselves. The great city will empty because no one will stay to serve chiefs who give them nothing in return. The final record contained an explicit warning: we built greatness through cooperation. We destroyed greatness through greed. The chiefs who hoarded everything lost everything when the people left. Remember this: a city is its people, and people will not stay where they cannot live well. Inequality destroys what it seeks to build. Archaeological evidence confirms this interpretation. The city wasn't destroyed violently. It was gradually abandoned as people dispersed to smaller communities. Excavations of common dwellings from the final period show they were simply walked away from, with possessions left behind, suggesting people left to seek better conditions elsewhere. When this was fully understood in 2016, sociologists and economists immediately noted the parallels. Modern inequality is approaching levels not seen in centuries. Wealth concentration in developed nations is extreme and growing. Social cohesion is fracturing. Political polarization is increasing. Cahokia's warning was explicit. Extreme inequality causes social collapse not through violent revolution, but through disintegration. People opt out of systems that don't serve them when they have the option. Cities and civilizations hollow out as people seek alternatives. We decoded this warning while inequality in modern societies reaches historically high levels. Cahokia tried to tell us that extreme inequality, even in prosperous societies, leads to collapse. We understood the message too late to prevent the conditions they warned about. The Anasazi drought response. In 2018, researchers decoded petroglyphs and kiva murals from ancestral Puebloan Anasazi sites in the American Southwest, dating to around 1280 AD. The images told a specific story. The people knew a catastrophic drought was coming because their elders had passed down knowledge of the previous droughts. They had warnings carved in stone telling them how to survive, reduce populations, disperse from large settlements, return to mobile lifestyles. But the religious and political leaders refused, believing their ceremonial practices would bring rain. The final petroglyphs show the consequences. Our fathers' fathers left us warnings in stone. We saw the signs they told us to watch for, but we believed our prayers were stronger than the patterns of the sky. We were wrong. Those who ignore the warnings of their ancestors will learn the same lessons through suffering. The ancestral Puebloans had built sophisticated civilizations in the American Southwest, including the famous cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and large pueblos at Chaco Canyon. Then, in the late 1200s, these sites were suddenly abandoned. The people dispersed, some moving south into New Mexico and Arizona, others disappearing from the archaeological record. Tree ring analysis had shown that a severe megadrought occurred during this period, but archaeologists debated why the people hadn't adapted. They'd survived droughts before. Why did this one cause complete abandonment? The petroglyphs and kiva murals provided the answer. Using improved photographic techniques and analysis by tribal scholars who understood symbolic systems, researchers decoded the images in 2018. Early petroglyphs showed symbols that tribal elders identified as drought warnings passed down from previous generations. The symbols depicted changing weather patterns, declining water levels, failing crops, and specific animals moving away from the region. These were indicators previous generations had learned meant serious drought was coming. Middle period images showed debates. Some petroglyphs depicted people advocating dispersal, splitting into smaller groups, moving to areas with more reliable water, returning to more mobile lifestyles. Other images showed religious leaders arguing for staying and increasing ceremonies to bring rain. Late images showed the consequences: depleted food stores, dying crops, dried springs, abandoned sections of pueblos, and most tellingly, images of people looking back at abandoned homes as they left. The final petroglyphs contained explicit messages. One, decoded with help from modern Pueblo people who recognize the symbolism, translates approximately to, "Our ancestors left warnings in stone. They survived great droughts by dispersing and moving. They told us, when you see these signs, do as we did. But our priests said we were stronger, our ceremonies more powerful, our society too great to follow the old ways. We stayed and suffered what mobility could have prevented." Another final petroglyph. Those who forget the wisdom of their ancestors learn it again through pain. The sky does not listen to prayers when it is time for drought. The patterns are bigger than our wishes. We should have heeded the warnings. Those who come after, do not make our mistake. When the signs appear, move before you must flee. The decoded warnings revealed that the ancestral Puebloans had institutional knowledge about surviving megadroughts. Their ancestors had experienced them before and left instructions. But religious and political structures that had developed during good times prevented the flexibility needed to follow those instructions. When this was decoded in 2018, climate researchers immediately saw the parallels. We have historical records and scientific knowledge about climate change. We know what's coming. We know what adaptations will help. But political, economic, and cultural systems developed during stable conditions prevent us from making necessary changes. The ancestral Puebloans tried to warn us. When you ignore warnings from those who experienced disaster before, you'll learn the same lesson. We decoded their warning while actively ignoring warnings from climate scientists, Pacific Islanders experiencing sea level rise, and communities already experiencing climate disasters. The Library of Alexandria Catalog. In 2020, archaeologists recovered and translated a fragmentary catalog from the Library of Alexandria dating to around 100 BC. The catalog listed works that had been donated to the library from earlier civilizations, including summaries of their contents. Multiple entries describe texts from even more ancient sources, warning about cyclical catastrophes. From the archives of the Old Kingdom, records of the Great Burning, when the sky rained fire and ash covered the sun, occurs in cycles of thousands of years. The warning signs are the mountains smoking, the earth shaking frequently, the animals fleeing before the catastrophe. When these signs appear together, seek high ground far from the smoking mountains. The catalog revealed that ancient peoples had been trying to warn their descendants about predictable catastrophes, but the knowledge was lost when the library burned. The fragments were discovered during excavations in Alexandria, preserved through a combination of unusual circumstances. They had been stored in a waterproof container that ended up buried in mud, creating anaerobic conditions that prevented decay. The catalog represented a systematic attempt to organize knowledge from across the ancient world. It listed thousands of works, many now completely lost. What shocked researchers was how many entries described warnings from even earlier civilizations. One entry summarized a text from ancient Egypt. Chronicles of the Priests of Memphis, copied from texts predating the pyramids, describes the Great Burning when mountains exploded and covered the sky with ash. Many died from the falling ash and from the cold that followed when the sun was blocked. The text states this occurs in cycles and gives signs to watch for: unusual activity of fire mountains, frequent earth tremors, animals showing distress and fleeing the regions of fire mountains. Modern geologists immediately recognize this as describing volcanic winter, the global cooling that occurs when massive volcanic eruptions inject ash into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight. The Toba eruption, 74,000 years ago, nearly wiped out humanity. Smaller eruptions have caused famines throughout history. The ancient text was describing real phenomena and warning about predictable cycles. Another entry, from the Babylonian archives, account of the great wave that destroyed the coastal cities. Text claims this happens when the earth shakes beneath the ocean, provides warning signs: the water retreating far from shore, animals fleeing inland, the earth shaking before the wave arrives. Instructions given to flee inland and to high ground when these signs appear. This is a precise description of tsunami warning signs. The ancient Babylonians, or whoever they copied the text from, had observed tsunami behavior and understood the warning signs. They'd recorded this knowledge so future generations could survive. Multiple entries describe texts warning about drought cycles, flood cycles, and disease pandemics with observable patterns. The ancient world apparently had a sophisticated understanding of predictable catastrophes and had been trying to preserve and transmit survival knowledge. The catalog's final pages, heavily damaged but partially readable, contain the librarian's own observations. We gather the wisdom of ages so that when catastrophe comes, humanity will know the signs and how to survive. These cycles are greater than kingdoms. They destroy civilizations that forget. The purpose of this library is to prevent forgetting. May these works survive to warn those who come after us. The irony is that the Library of Alexandria itself was destroyed. Multiple fires over centuries eliminated the accumulated knowledge it contained. When researchers decoded the catalog in 2020, they realized how much warning knowledge had been lost. Ancient peoples had observed patterns, survived disasters, and recorded their knowledge specifically to warn future generations, and it was destroyed before it could be passed on. Modern disasters prove we needed those warnings. Volcanic eruptions still catch populations unprepared. Tsunamis still kill thousands because coastal populations don't know the signs. We're relearning through tragedy what ancient peoples had figured out and tried to tell us. The catalog was decoded in 2020, too late to access the knowledge it referenced, too late to learn from the warnings ancient peoples had preserved, too late to prevent us from repeating disasters they had learned to predict and survive. These 10 ancient warnings share a haunting pattern. Each came from a civilization that experienced catastrophe and tried to prevent future peoples from repeating their mistakes. They carved their warnings in stone, passed them down through oral tradition, wrote them in now dead languages, encoded them in symbols we took centuries to understand, and we decoded them all too late. The Maya warned us about deforestation causing environmental collapse. We decoded it while deforesting the Amazon. The Mesopotamians warned about antibiotic resistance. We understood them after decades of antibiotic overuse. The Pacific Islanders warned about climate-driven sea level rise. We listened after the seas were already rising. The Romans warned about the pattern of civilizational collapse. We recognized it while experiencing every element they described. What makes these warnings particularly tragic is that they weren't hidden. The Mayan inscriptions were visible for over 1,000 years. The Pacific oral traditions were recorded by anthropologists in the 1800s. The Easter Island tablets were collected by European visitors. The knowledge was available. We just couldn't understand it until we'd already repeated the mistakes being warned about. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is what this suggests about warnings we still haven't decoded. Archaeological sites worldwide contain untranslated inscriptions. Oral traditions in endangered languages contain knowledge we haven't recorded. Ancient texts in archives remain unread. How many other warnings are we missing? What catastrophes are we walking blindly toward because we haven't understood the signs previous civilizations left us? The pattern is clear and troubling. Civilizations experience disasters, learn painful lessons, and try desperately to warn those who come after. But the knowledge is lost or misunderstood. Each generation repeats the mistakes of its ancestors, experiencing the same catastrophes that could have been prevented if the warnings had been understood. We live in a unique moment. We have the ability to decode ancient languages, to understand ancient warnings, to learn from civilizations that came before us. But we're also experiencing many of the exact catastrophes they warned about. The question is, will we finally listen now that we understand? Or will we become another civilization, leaving warnings for the future? Warnings that will be decoded too late by people repeating our mistakes. The ancient warnings we've decoded point to one consistent message. The patterns repeat. Environmental destruction leads to collapse. Inequality fractures societies. Climate change displaces populations. Inflexibility prevents adaptation. Every civilization believes it's different, more advanced, immune to the forces that destroyed previous societies. Every civilization is wrong. We decoded the warnings too late to prevent the disasters they predicted, but perhaps not too late to learn the deeper lesson. Listen to those who survived catastrophes before you. Their warnings weren't mythology or superstition. They were survival knowledge earned through suffering. The question is whether we'll finally listen, or whether future archaeologists will decode our warnings, too late to save themselves from repeating our mistakes.